When the card was declined at the checkout, the room went quiet in a way that felt like snow settling on a city that expected thunder. Miles Carrington, a man who had lived most of his adult life inside glass towers and late-night meetings, looked down at the little square machine as if it had betrayed him. He was 42 years old, worth enough to be anonymous in any room, but tonight visible in a rumpled blazer and a fatigue he had perfected. It was a Tuesday evening. The boutique grocery on 3rd was warm with fluorescent hum and the smell of roasted coffee. And his cart was full of things that came to stand for a life he had never learned to explain. People turned their heads slowly, some curious, some indulgent, some openly impatient. No one expected what happened next. A small girl, no more than 8, reached into her pocket, counted coins with a solemn care that made even Miles forget his pride, and offered something that would set off a chain of choices none of them were ready for. Stay with this until the end to see how a tiny act of generosity could unravel a man built on advantages and rebuild him in public. It had started as a routine errand. Miles had decided, after 2 long weeks of conference calls and dinners where his smile had been an automatic response to investment pitches, to cook for himself. He had pictured simplicity, a quiet meal, perhaps the old jazz record he never played. He pushed the cart slowly, fingers tapping against a leather wallet that had no edges, like the meetings he kept. The store hummed with lives intersecting. There was Linda at the checkout, her name tag soft with years, humming a soap jingle as she rang items. A teenager on a work program navigated the scanner with a clumsy pride. A woman in a hijab adjusted the strap of a cloth bag. The light over the produce winked. The air smelled of basil and citrus, of warm bread and plastic bags. Miles placed his card on the counter, a card designed to be accepted without question. And when the machine blinked declined, he felt his confidence lose traction. The room shifted. Some people glanced away politely. Some watched with the sharp curiosity reserved for small public failures. The cashier's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. The teenage bagger looked between them. The woman in the hijab inhaled as if to offer moral cover. There were shuffles of feet and a low murmur. Miles could feel heat at his neck, the memory of a boardroom in his chest where small signs of weakness never went unnoticed. He smiled, too quick, and told the cashier not to worry, that he would call his bank. The words landed thin. A chorus of small judgments swelled. A man behind him cleared his throat and said under his breath that this was why you kept cash. And the teenager tapped her watch as if time could penalize poverty and embarrassment equally. The teenager in the uniform offered a sympathetic look and then looked away, a youngness that respected the boundary between curiosity and interference. Linda, the cashier, closed her lips and continued scanning. Miles could feel the plate of his life tilting toward ridicule. He tried a few phone calls, voice low and practiced, while the machine glowed like an accusation. He dialed his assistant and listened as someone on the other end assured him the accounts had been reconciled. He tried the card again. It declined again. At that precise beating of a second, a quiet rustle came from the end of the lane, and a small hand placed a fist of change on the counter. The coins were wrapped in a folded dollar bill and a note that said simply, "For your sandwich." The signature was a scrawl, E. The hand belonged to Emma Ruiz, 8 years old, hair in 2 braids, a face that bore the kind of seriousness one usually saw at solemn church suppers or in the eyes of people who had to grow up faster than the world expects. She wore a school backpack that looked like it had seen better days, and eyes that saw Miles not as a CEO or a story, but as a human being who had made a mistake. "Here," she said, voice small but firm. "My mom says you have to be brave and say thank you." The checkout lane froze into a tableau of gasps and softened gazes. Miles looked at the coins, at the tiny bill, at Emma's earnest face. For a suspended moment, he felt absurd and infinite. reduced and elevated at once. He wanted to refuse, to pay back more, to reclaim his dignity with a larger gesture that would erase the memory of the declined card. Instead, his hands trembled and he reached out. He took the change, and in that touch, he felt the weight of a decision he did not yet understand. The people in line reacted like a small jury. Some whispered about charity and image. Mrs. Alvarez, the woman with the watch, pursed her lips and then gave a tiny nod, an acknowledgement of the moral calculus unfolding. The teenager in the uniform, whose name tag read Jaden, watched with an expression that mixed disbelief and something like hope. Linda, the cashier, who had worked this lane for 12 years, folded her hands and simplified the scene into routine compassion. She told Miles that Emma had insisted, that she and her mom had been in before, and Emma had been counting coins for lunch. Linda looked at Emma with a softness that suggested she had been young and hungry once too. The air had changed into an audience, but also a congregation. For Miles, the moment split his past from everything that could follow. He paid the remainder of his groceries with cash from his wallet. And then, with a voice that cracked just a little, he asked Emma if she would let him buy her a sandwich and a chocolate. Her cheeks lit in a shy flare, and she nodded. The crowd made room. Backstory unfolded not in dense narration, but in the way Miles moved and spoke that evening. He had been born into money in a town where houses stood like claims staked against the sky. His parents separated securities and expectations, a father who measured worth in acquisitions, and a mother who taught him to never be seen failing. As a boy, he learned to play the part at charity galas and to recite the proper lines of sympathy without feeling the sting of poverty. At university, he studied markets and human behavior, convinced that profit was the answer to any lack. His career had been a staircase of doors that opened because of introductions, not because of gifts he had earned. He had learned early that error must be hidden, that vulnerability would be interpreted as softness and punished by consequence. Years of accumulation had built a fortress where he lived on the top floor and looked down at the world. Yet inside, between the leather and the appointments, there had been a small hollow he tried to fill with more. When his marriage failed 3 years earlier, he retreated into acquisitions, into companies that promised both return and a distraction. At 42, he had millions and very few apologies to show for them. The decline at the checkout was not simply a financial hiccup, it was a mirror. It reflected every avoidance and every calculation he had used to avoid looking at the empty spots of his life. Emma's coin was a key, even if he did not yet know which door it would open. That memory of the charity galas of his childhood, the soft applause and the strategic speeches, had conditioned him to give in a way that secured reputation. He had never experienced giving that demanded no public recognition until that Tuesday evening. The backstory sat in his chest like a lodged coin, warm and heavy, and as he walked out of the store, he carried not only groceries, but an unfamiliar lightness. Miles invited Emma and her mother, Rosa, to a small deli 2 blocks away. Rosa accepted with a wary smile and a protective glance toward her daughter. The deli smelled of garlic and reheated meat, of paper napkins and lemon oil. While the sandwich was prepared, they spoke in small exchanges that unveiled more of Emma and her family. Emma lived with her mother and an older brother, Matteo, who worked nights at a laundromat. Her father had left 2 years earlier, and the rent had been paid late more than once. Rosa cleaned offices during the day and sometimes picked up shifts on weekends. She counted her hours like prayers. Emma kept an after-school program folder in her backpack and carried a library card like a talisman. She liked math and had a way of noticing patterns in the crumbs on the table. The conversation moved gradually from pleasantries to the quiet outlines of need. Miles listened, and instead of directing the talk toward his usual comparisons, he asked about school projects and what Emma wanted to be. She said quietly that she wanted to be an architect because she liked building things that lasted. Miles, who had always built companies and walls, felt a strange alignment. He offered to help with school supplies, and Rosa looked at him with suspicion and gratitude. The offer was small and unremarkable for someone of his means, but for them it signaled a possibility. As the days continued, the incident refused to stay in the past. Miles found himself thinking about Emma at odd hours. He began to walk to work sometimes, a small rebellion against the sterile cab rides he had used to keep his life compartmentalized. He volunteered to meet with Rosa and Emma again to deliver the promised school supplies. On the third meeting, he met Melina, the boy at the laundromat where Mateo worked, who spoke of the after-school tutoring program with a practical bluntness that suggested he had been priced for life. He encountered Ana Santos, a program coordinator at a local community center, who introduced him to the realities of the neighborhood in a way that spreadsheets could not. A reporter named Jenna Harper would later call, curious about the millionaire who had stumbled and then offered help. A competitor in his company, Soren Blake, smirked at the news of public attention, smelling a PR opportunity. There were now at least 7 other people whose paths intersected with Miles since that night. Linda the cashier, Jaden the teenage bagger, Rosa, Mateo, Anna, Jenna, and Soren. Each had an action to take, a voice to add, a judgment to make. The incident had broadened into a social web. The first moment of real tension arrived when a local blogger posted a short clip of the checkout lane. The video was modest, the kind of content that seeks the voyeuristic sweet spot between curiosity and moral lesson. It showed Miles, the card reader, Emma handing the coins, and the murmurs. The caption asked whether millionaires should accept help at all. The clip spread locally and then was picked up by Jenna, the reporter, who asked for an interview. Miles agreed, believing he could control the narrative by framing the act as a wake-up call, as an anecdote about humility learned briefly. In the interview, he was practiced and candid in a way that the board of his company had not expected. When Jenna published the piece with a headline that framed the event as a turning point, something shifted. Miles began to be scrutinized not only for why his card had declined, but for motives beneath his offers. People wondered whether his sudden attention to a local school was sincere or a staged PR move. The tension grew as Soren Blake, his competitor, leaked an internal memo suggesting that the donations Miles proposed could be tax advantageous and opportunistic. Miles felt the public eye as a pressure of wind, and he was not sure whether his next moves would be interpreted as generosity or manipulation. The second tense rupture came from within his own company. His board called a meeting and questioned his focus on local outreach. They pressed numbers and questioned return on investment in a language Miles had always spoken fluently. He found himself defending a gesture he had not fully defined to people whose lives were measured in quarterly results. Soren smiled as he presented algorithms and scenarios that made social programs look like liabilities. Miles answered with a tired conviction that broke through his typical performance. He insisted that the company had a responsibility to do more than profit. The exchange escalated into a private argument with Soren in a glass office where voices echoed and consequences hung like lamps. "You are playing with public perception," Soren said. "This is not the place for soft politics." Miles, for the first time, considered walking away from parts of his empire that required a calculation over compassion. The board's skepticism left leaks in his confidence. He was tested. The third moment of tension arrived when someone filed a complaint suggesting that the donations were a front for embezzlement. Anonymous emails arrived at the company legal department, and the media smelled scandal. Investigators called for records. Miles had to open access to parts of his accounts he usually kept sealed. The process of being investigated felt like a slow unzipping of the private life he had constructed. It was messy and public. His name ran next to words like inquiry and audit, and some of the same people who had been quick to sympathy now raised questions about integrity. He found himself facing a choice: defend every transaction with legal precision, or step back and tell the truth as he understood it. The investigation forced Miles to confront how shallow his previous gestures had been and whether his recent actions were sustainable. The family he had begun to help watched quietly, and Emma, who had become a small symbol, asked him once if he would be okay. Miles realized that the most important part of the change was not what others thought of him, but whether he could live by the choices he made when the external applause was gone. At the point where the community had already decided to speak and the press had sharpened its teeth, a formal pause in the narrative arrives here to invite you to respond. If you have ever felt shame in public or have been the recipient of a small kindness that changed your day, breathe. You are not alone. Share with the community what was the most unexpected kindness you ever received. Start your comment with, "I received so," that others can connect and find solace in shared experience. Your story can encourage someone to believe that tiny actions matter. Meanwhile, we return to the story to see how a small gesture and a big man's reckoning would end up reshaping more than one life. Miles did not retreat when the investigation widened. Instead, he did something neither his advisors nor his board expected. He gathered the people he had met at the neighborhood center, including Anna, Rosa, and the director, a practical woman named Claudia. And he began to listen more than speak. He opened meetings where parents could voice needs, where teachers could propose realistic budgets, and where Mateo could explain the hours necessary for tutoring that would actually fit around work. In the presence of the community, the language of profitability softened into practical needs. Miles committed to funding a scholarship for underprivileged students at the local school and to pay for a part-time counselor. He committed to transparency and to an independent audit overseen by Anna and a small committee of neighborhood members. The gesture was not just monetary, it was procedural. He signed the first paperwork in the community center, his pen wobbling in a hand that had been taught to avoid uncertainty. The scene filled with sensory detail. The center smelled of old books and chalk. Light slanted through dusty blinds. The table was sticky from spilled glue. A clock ticked, and laughter came in small bursts. Conversation moved from numbers to names and commitments. Miles felt a strange humility settle. He had stepped into an exchange that demanded accountability. But change outside the office was not without pushback. An old investor, Candace Monroe, called and read a ledger like scripture, accusing him of squandering shareholder value for sentimental theater. Soren circulated a memo suggesting Miles was destabilizing the company. Meanwhile, the anonymous accusations grew, including a rumor that the funds were being misallocated. The investigative process involved lawyers and a meeting with a government oversight officer named Deputy Lang. He asked for records and receipts, and, for the first time, Miles read his financial statements aloud in public was under a fluorescent conference lamp as a group of neighborhood volunteers and company auditors listened. The technical description of how the donations would be distributed followed a sober tone. It explained the process of setting up a trust, the legal requirements for an education fund, the escrow accounts, the way checks would be issued to the school and monitored by a community committee. The explanation was procedural and dry, and it lasted only a few minutes. But it mattered because it converted intention into an accountable method. The process description included how donors would receive regular audits, how the trust would be independent of company finances, and how community representatives would have veto power on expenditures, a small but meaningful barrier against misuse. The technicalities reassured some and inflamed others. The tension remained. The fall was not a single moment, but a slow process. Reveal of vulnerability. One evening, a compromise email from an old friend suggested Miles resign from certain duties to focus on reconciliation and care. He faced leaked documents about expense accounts he had long used for personal travel and whose justification seemed thin under intense public scrutiny. The moral complexity of his past choices came to light, and the media framed it as a story of greed transformed into performative repentance. Miles retreated. He sat in his apartment looking at the city and felt small among lights that he had once believed he controlled. He called Rosa and confessed that he had been overwhelmed. She listened and then quietly told him that what counted was whether he stayed. The family he had tried to help, who had become embroiled in the public debate by mere association, stood by him with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Emma wrote him a note that said simply, "Thank you for believing in my drawings and in me, and nothing else." That note became a hinge. Support arrived from unlikely places. Linda, the cashier, organized a small petition among regular customers to ask that the focus remain on building the school program, not on personal scandals. Jaden, the teenage bagger, spoke about how the city needed leaders to change their definitions of success. Anna and Claudia publicly vouched for the transparency of the fund. Jenna, the reporter, who had once questioned motives, produced a piece that highlighted the voices of the parents and teachers who had stood to gain concrete help. Even Soren, seeing the public shift, suggested a mediated solution that would protect investor interests while leaving the fund independent. These acts of solidarity created a scaffold for Miles to move forward. In the hardest night of his life, when the investigation seemed to tighten and his board asked him to take an unpaid leave, Miles stood in the community center and told the assembled parents and volunteers the truth. He spoke of mistakes, of privilege, and of learning. He admitted that his first response to Emma had been confusing and imperfect, but also honest. He committed to stepping aside from certain corporate roles to devote time to ensuring the project succeeded. That decision was a personal cost he had not planned on paying, but which felt right. The family he had become connected to hugged him with a mixture of relief and wariness. The city watched, and some ridiculed, others celebrated. The arc was messy but real. There were moments of public tension that required procedural clarity. A formal audit revealed minor bookkeeping errors and clumsy record-keeping, but no criminal intent. The county auditor recommended improved oversight and the establishment of an independent board for the trust. Miles accepted these stipulations and worked with Anna and Claudia to implement them. The board of his company agreed to a temporary restructuring that limited his executive authority, but allowed him to continue as a non-executive advisor. He took on a role that hands-on involvement with the program rather than the power to dictate from a distance. Each small victory and accountability reinforced the new shape of his life. Over the next 6 months, things settled into a rhythm that looked nothing like the way he had lived before. The epilogue unfolds in 3 moments that trace real change and consequence. 1 month after the incident, the community center held its first official meeting to approve the scholarship recipients. The room was crowded. The smell of coffee and hopeful paperwork filled the air. A panel of community representatives and educators read applications with care. Emma was among the students awarded a small stipend for school supplies and a place in a new after-school architecture club run by volunteers. Miles attended and listened. He did not dominate. He learned to take notes and to ask questions that were not about optics, but about feasibility. The trust release was small but symbolic. Parents signed forms and took tentative photos with clumsy smiles. The local paper ran a piece that emphasized the practical steps now underway rather than the earlier spectacle. Miles felt a lightness he had not expected. 3 months in, the relationship between Miles and the neighborhood had deepened. A small workshop space was set up at the community center with donated tools and materials. Miles organized a volunteer day where employees from his company came to help build a model school garden. Some came reluctantly, but left with a kind of surprised satisfaction. Emma taught other kids how to sketch simple structures from cardboard. Mateo enrolled in a vocational program supported by scholarship funds that allowed him to adjust his work schedule and attend day classes. The trust published its first audit online, clear and navigable, and the independent board, which included Anna and Claudia, had vetoed 2 dubious spending proposals that would have been poorly judged. The transparency reassured many of the critics and converted some skeptics into collaborators. Jenna wrote a feature that highlighted the voices of parents who now had fewer worries about supplies and tuition. Citizens posted before and after photos of the after-school space. Miles started speaking at small local events about accountability and about the importance of listening when attempting to help. 6 months after the checkout lane, the tangible outcomes were apparent and less spectacular but more durable. The scholarship program had supported 7 students financially and 12 more through tutoring services. A small clinic initiative had been seeded with partner organizations to provide counseling for children and parents facing economic stress. The Architecture Club held a public exhibition of cardboard models designed by neighborhood children, and curious adults came. Emma stood in front of her model, drawing attention without knowing it, and her face carried a quiet pride. Miles had resigned from one senior role at his company and taken an advisory position that allowed him to spend mornings in the community and afternoons at strategy sessions. He had learned to delegate and to accept that influence does not require domination. The trust had become a model for local philanthropic projects because of its procedural rigor and community oversight. The city council announced a small grant to replicate the program in 2 other districts. People interviewed remarked that the change felt less like a hero story and more like the establishment of structures that could sustain goodwill across the city. What started with coins at a counter had become an institutional effort that honored dignity. There were still critiques. Some argued that the initial attention put too much pressure on a small family. Others remained suspicious of any wealthy person who professed change. But the community found its footing in proof more than pronouncement. Rosa received a job offer at the community center to coordinate parent outreach, a role that came with security and benefits. Mateo finished his vocational course and got a day job that reduced the family workload. Emma, whose sketches had been used to design simple neighborhood improvements, received a small scholarship that allowed her to attend a weekend architecture class where she met mentors who encouraged practical steps toward her dream. Miles found the habit of being present more fulfilling than any acquisition. He visited the center regularly, often with his sleeves rolled up, sometimes serving juice at events, learning to measure success by the faces around him rather than by the numbers on a balance sheet. Along the way, the story left behind moments that had become symbolic for those who lived through them. The folded dollar on the counter, which Emma kept in a small box and later donated to the trust. A chocolate bar Miles bought and shared with a group of kids. A worn backpack that became a symbol of worth rather than pity. The city slowly reframed the narrative from spectacle to substance. People began to ask different questions. How do we create structures for sustained generosity? How do we build oversight that centers the voices of those helped? The legal and procedural frameworks that had once been tools for exclusion became instruments for accountability and inclusion. The small governance model was published as a case study in a local nonprofit newsletter and talked about at conferences where Miles was invited to speak as someone who had learned through discomfort. In the quiet moments, when Miles walked past the community center and saw children sketching under a sun that cut through a painted window, he felt a recalibration. He thought about the way power feels when redistributed and the responsibilities that attach to it. He knew the personal cost had been steep at times. He had to answer for past decisions and to forgive himself enough to move forward. Yet in return, he gained something less flashy than a headline, but more lasting: the ability to be present for a project that did not bear his name, but did bear his energy. He learned to accept help, to be corrected, and to be preferred. Sustain a commitment that demanded more than a single generous moment. The transformation was not complete, but it had roots. If this story moved you, help it reach someone who might be inspired. Share this video and subscribe to follow more stories of ordinary moments that lead to lasting change. Small acts matter, and together we can build systems that turn courage into community. Remember, sometimes the smallest hand reaches across the largest gap, and the world becomes different because someone counted their coins and decided to give.